Constantine's reforms to the military worked out pretty well for the emperor at the time, but eventually they became the source of some of the harshest criticisms of his reign. By pulling the stronger, faster, and better trained troops off the frontiers, the feeling was that he was fatally weakening the borderlands and leaving them far more vulnerable than they needed to be. Plus, by dropping huge garrisons in the cities of the interior, those cities were suddenly dealing with the burden of feeding and housing all of these troops. Far from the front lines, the soldiers grew soft, and the citizens became embittered. Morale suffered all around, and that old disconnect between the armed forces and the civilian population was revived with a vengeance. Finally, though there are many ways to look at the issue, Constantine's willingness to populate the legions with soldiers of German descent and augment his armies with German auxiliary forces was seen as a crucial development in the story of how the Western Empire fell. Because, the theory goes, once the Germans wormed their way into the military, the ultimate destruction of the empire became a matter not of if, but of when. But like I say, the reforms worked pretty well at the time, and for the 12 years he was sole emperor, the legions won every single campaign they initiated, and they initiated a lot, mostly against the Franks and the Alemanni on the Rhine, and the Sarmatians and Goths along the Danube. In fact, after being pushed back by the barbarians during the crisis of the 3rd century, the Romans finally, consistently, found themselves having the upper hand in their dealings with the Northern Menace. Things went so well that Constantine actually felt comfortable building a permanent bridge Trajan had once built and Aurelian had torn down across the Danube. There was even a brief period in the early 330s when the Romans reoccupied Lower Dacia. Aware that his execution of Crispus had left him without an experienced heir, Constantine began handing all of these wars off to his younger sons to season them up a bit. None of them were quite old enough to hold down a command of their own, but they were put in nominal charge and told to stick close at the capable generals actually running things and learn everything they could as fast as they could. In 330, Constantine II earned the title Alemannicus, and in 332, at the age of 15, he fought in a successful war against the Goths. Constantius II, meanwhile, was sent to acquaint himself with the eastern provinces, and had there actually been a war with Persia, which we'll get to in a second, he certainly would have found himself right smack dab in the middle of it. Constantine's youngest son, Constans, was still just a child during the latter part of his father's reign, but he was made Caesar in 333, and likely would have followed his older brothers had the emperor lived. The implications of all this began to become clear. Constantine was not favoring one son over any of the others, and it appeared that the emperor expected all three of them to succeed him to power, in the spirit, if not the form, of the Tetrarchy. If Constantine's redeployment of the empire's military forces raises eyebrows among scholars, then his succession plan makes them bang their heads against the wall. I don't think in all my research I have read a single good thing about how Constantine chose to leave the imperial house when he died. Had Crispus lived, it is probable that Constantine would have passed the throne directly to his eldest son, who was both a proven leader and eminently capable. But after, murdering him, Constantine was left with a pile of sons and nephews, all of whom were young, all of whom were relatively inexperienced, none of whom really stood out against the others. So Constantine decided to just leave the empire to the whole lot of them, and let them figure it out for themselves. Constantine II was to receive the western provinces, Constantius II the eastern provinces, Constans, Italy, and Pannonia. One step-nephew, a man named Dalmatius, was to receive Thrace, Macedonia, and Achaia, and another, Hannibalianus, was to have some sort of vague authority over the far eastern borderlands. Had the sons of Constantine been paragons of virtue and filled with fraternal love, the arrangement might have worked. But unfortunately, they had all grown up in the shadow of their father, a man who had spent his entire life ruthlessly dispatching members of his own family in order to demolish a carefully arranged power-sharing agreement. Over the years, he had killed his father-in-law, 3 brothers-in-law, 1 nephew, his son, and his wife, all in the name of securing and maintaining sole control of the Roman Empire. His sons learned this lesson well, and if Constantine thought that they were not going to follow in his footsteps, then he was blind, or he was crazy, or both. More than a few people have accused him of simply being so egomaniacal that he just didn't care what happened after he died. We'll get into it more next week, but suffice it to say that Constantine had raised a basket full of vipers, and it took them about 7 seconds to turn on each other once the old man was gone. Which brings us to one of Constantine's last and most controversial initiatives. At some point between 334 and 336 AD, the emperor got it into his head that he was going to provoke a war with Persia. Why he thought this would be a good idea, especially since the legions were bogged down on both the Rhine and Danube frontiers, remains a mystery, but there you have it. The groundwork for the war had been laid at some point after he defeated Licinius, when the emperor sent a strongly worded letter to the Sassanid king, informing him that Constantine considered the Christians in Sassanid territory to be his clients, and that he would have no qualms about taking any necessary steps to ensure their safety. The Sassanid king did not miss the fact that this was pretty much exactly the same line of thinking that Constantine had just used to pick a war with Licinius. Tensions were kept to a low simmer until the mid-330s, when Constantine decided to confer upon his step-nephew, Hannibalianus, the title King of Kings of the Pontic people, which was basically the equivalent of the Sassanid king appointing someone emperor of the Roman people. In other words, pretty provocative stuff. So the Persians got a little paranoid, especially about the Christian king of Armenia, who they now saw as a part of a larger plan to encircle and conquer them. So, probably in 336, the Sassanid king invaded Armenia and deposed the Christian king, which could not have played more into Constantine's hands, and the old emperor began to gear up for one last great campaign. But he would never make it out of Bithynia. Not long after Easter 337, the emperor fell ill and left Constantinople to recover at the hot baths near the city of Helenopolis, named for the emperor's mother. After a short visit to the Turkish coast, Constantine realized that he was not going to recover, and he tried to make it back to Constantinople so he could die in the city he had created. But he was only able to make it as far as the suburbs of Nicomedia. Knowing that the end was near, Constantine summoned the bishop of Nicomedia to formally baptize him. People often express surprise and wonder at the fact that the first Christian emperor was not baptized until moments before his death, and a cynical reading often results. Usually that reading goes something like this: the emperor never was a true Christian, and even now was just hedging his bets. But there is another reading that I often find more compelling. Constantine was a true believer who was really, really afraid of the Lord our God. Baptism washed away all your accumulated sins, and basically left you with a blank moral slate. If you truly believe, then, that too much sin would hurt your ability to make it into heaven, it is only logical to wait until the last possible moment to get baptized. That way, you would go in clean as a newborn babe. It was a dangerous game because, hey, what if you get run over by an ox cart? But it was a game that Constantine evidently played and won, because in the few days between his baptism and his death, he didn't murder a single one of his family members. So, pure as a fresh mountain stream, on May the 22nd, 337 AD, Constantine the Great died. He was 65 years old and had been an emperor for almost 31 years. Constantine was a strong political leader, indisputably the greatest general of his age, and a visionary who transformed the religious and cultural life of the empire like no emperor before him. Before he rose to power, Christianity was a religion being hunted down like a criminal, and when he died, Rome was so far down the road to conversion that Julian the Apostate's attempt to turn back the tide simply confirmed how much Constantine had entrenched his new religion. Beyond that epoch-shifting feat, he also built a new capital on the Bosphorus that quite literally became the most important city in the world for 1,000 years. But these great, truly great achievements were offset by a darker set of legacies. And when the critiques of Constantine's military reforms are coupled with his handling of the Sassanids and his handling of the succession issue, what we are left with is a great emperor with a mixed record. Because one of the major questions we must ask when assessing an imperial career is, did he leave the empire stronger and safer than he found it? In Constantine's case, it is not uncommon to hear scholars and historians say, well, no, he did not. His new gold standard served to stabilize the economy, yes, but only for the upper classes. The rest of the citizen body was left scrambling to keep up in a world of runaway inflation. Mostly they could not keep up, and the roots of medieval feudalism with its serfs and its lords is not too difficult to detect. His inexplicable desire to start up a war with the Sassanids would leave his heirs tied to an unnecessary conflict with the Persians for years that would cost men and resources and at least one emperor that Rome really couldn't spare. And, of course, his ill-conceived dynastic plans all but guaranteed a return to the dark days of civil war. Constantine the Great was a great emperor, and easily one of the most important figures in all of world history. But despite the key role he played in the evolution of the West, we should not forget that he was also a flawed man who was fully capable of making bad choices that his heirs paid for in blood and treasure. Some would even go so far as to trace the fall of the Western Empire right to his doorstep. Gibbon's whole thesis, for example, was that Christianity was a malignant cancer that eventually killed the empire. I wouldn't go that far, because nothing Constantine did guaranteed a catastrophe of that magnitude, and some of the things he did, like furthering the Germanization of the army, only turned out to be bad ideas in retrospect because of how his successors handled the issue, not because they were inherently bad ideas. Constantine was a complicated man who lived in and utterly dominated complicated times. Whatever your view of the man, noble Christian saint or reckless theocratic tyrant, he changed the course of world history, and for that reason alone, we will never, ever stop talking about him. Next week, we will stop talking about Constantine. Instead, a live and in-person me will be back to discuss the bloody struggle that erupted between his sons and nephews the minute the emperor was dead. It would take 13 years of strife, backstabbing, and discord before the empire was once again united under a single man, the craftiest and ruthless of all Constantine's heirs, Constantius II. Hello, and welcome to the History